So Denmark's Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, has once again asked the United States to stop threatening to take over Greenland after President Trump said he absolutely needs Greenland. Colombia, Cuba, Iran, what next? And that big question, is there no rules-based order in the world? Has global response been rather muted? Let's try and make sense of some of these developments. Joining us on this special broadcast, Ambassador Yash Sinha, former Indian Ambassador to Venezuela, former High Commissioner to the United Kingdom. Vanessa Neumann is former Ambassador of Venezuela to the United Kingdom. Welcome. Lieutenant General Syed Ata Hasnain is former Military Secretary and an Analyst of International Relations, as is Daniel Silverberg, Managing Director at Capstone in the United States of America. Ambassador Neumann, Keir Starmer is a very well-respected human rights lawyer, the Prime Minister of the UK. The opposition in the UK has urged him to condemn US actions, but he's refrained. Has Europe's response been rather muted in your view? And what does this mean for rules-based order?
Thank you very much for having me. I think it isn't for the rules-based order because Maduro was not a legitimate president. He had lost a presidential election. Your own country is the biggest democracy in the world, and he lost a presidential election, and yet he clung to the presidential palace. He was supposed to have left on the 10th of January of 2025. So he did not have the legitimacy, and he did not have immunity. He was a wanted drug trafficker, narco-terrorist, for very solid investigations that had dated back to even while Chavez was in power and Maduro was his foreign secretary. That information is clearly laid out. I personally have written a book about it, and the DEA has thousands of files on it. So, to my mind, this particular decapitation strike, the capture of Maduro, reinforced the rules-based order. You cannot cling to the presidential palace against the will of your people and do whatever you want to them.
But
and I have
should this come through the United Nations, or can a powerful democracy or a country like the United States take unilateral action? Because today it is the United States, tomorrow it could be China and Taiwan.
Well, that could be, and we might be facing that, China and Taiwan. And the Taiwanese, by the way, have a right to self-determination, the same way my people, the Venezuelans, have a right to their self-determination. Okay, what the situation is that that Venezuela wanted Maduro out, and the United States obliged. Now, in my personal opinion, I think other countries, but I have written since 2004, my doctorate was exactly about the fact that because the international order continues to do business, buy the oil, the gold, the diamonds, whatever the commodity is, and give people access to central banks, ports, airports, no matter what they do to their own people, is the proximate cause of tyranny around the world. So this is on all of us. The fact that we have so many tyrannies on the world is because they have learned that all you have to do is get into the presidential palace, win your first election, seize all the assets, seize all the resources, murder your own people, and nobody else will do anything about it. And now,
Ambassador Sinha, your reading. Okay, Ambassador Sinha, your reading of this, because what would this mean for rules-based order? Or should the United Nations just lock its doors, shut shop? Because now the US will decide what it wants to do in the Western Hemisphere.
Absolutely. I think the description that Ms. Neumann made of an autocratic leader can be applied to many leaders, current leaders, and people leading from behind. So should decapitation strikes be ordered against all of them? And one particular so-called leader, I call a failed marshal in our region, is the best friend there in the White House, is feted and given lunch. So I mean, this ridiculous argument that you have the right to go and abduct a president, legitimate or illegitimate is not the question. I'm aware that the elections, he had lost the elections, and Edmundo Gonzalez had actually won the elections. But where is Edmundo Gonzalez? Why has the Nicolás Maduro been abducted, and the vice president has been Rodriguez has now been Delcy Rodriguez is now the interim president. What about Machado, the Nobel Prize winner Maria Corina Machado? What about Edmundo Gonzalez, who won the election? If he's the legitimate president, shouldn't he be sitting in Miraflores Palace right now? So I think this whole thing of taking the law into your own hands, any and everybody can do it. It is setting a very bad example, and in my opinion, it opens a Pandora's box.
It does, because this would mean that the world, Daniel Silverberg, is just going by law of the jungle. Might is right. Trump doesn't like Maduro, so he'll have him abducted. What about the United Nations? Should this not have happened through the UN?
I think it's really important to understand how President Trump and his team are viewing this action before we assess how the UN and others might respond. President Trump viewed this as a backyard operation. He has been very clear in his national security strategy, in his rhetoric, and now I would argue in his actions, that the Western Hemisphere is an extension, in his view, of the United States. It is part of our sphere of influence. And as Marco Rubio said yesterday on Sunday shows, which, by the way, I think provided the clearest lens of the internal deliberations of the administration, Marco Rubio said we are not going to allow any country to serve as a platform for our adversaries, Russia, China, and Iran, to operate in our region. So I frankly don't think that this administration is particularly concerned about the UN in this instance, about a multilateral approach. They viewed it as a Monroe Doctrine-like backyard sphere of influence effort to protect the US. And we can argue whether this was the right move or not, but I think for starters, it's critical to understand how they were viewing it.
Okay, so the president is gone, the regime remains. Depends whether it will be stable and how stable will it be in the times to come. But Ambassador Neumann, it's Venezuela today, Cuba tomorrow, or Colombia tomorrow, Greenland next, Iran on target. This would somehow indicate that rules-based order have now been thrown out of the window. UN does not matter. It depends what President Trump thinks.
Thank you. And by the way, my surname is pronounced Neumann, like Freud. Okay, that's all right. Unfortunately, I'm used to it. I think I absolutely 100% agree with what Mark Silverberg said. It was very clearly stated in the national security strategy that the United States views this as their sphere of influence and views it as a threat to their national security, the drugs, the migration. Don't forget, 9 million people, myself included, have fled Venezuela.
Left the country.
Have left the country. It's bigger than Ireland, okay? And because they can't, there's no life there. There's only repression, corruption, and it's a horrible life. So they've gone to find better lives elsewhere. Now, I think that the UN has been ineffectual for a very long time. I wrote about this again back in 2004, saying that what I argued was actually based on what was chic at the time, was the responsibility to protect. Does anybody remember that? The R2P doctrine that was going through the United Nations and was supposed to help us, have a cosmopolitan view of our international brotherhood to defend our rights. That is the ethical and moral justification. The responsibility to protect of the United Nations is really what underpins that type of action. On the one hand. On the other hand, you also have the national security strategy of the United States, that the Western Hemisphere is the biggest source of migration, drugs, and trade. And yeah, they're concerned about it. As for the other countries,
so two very important points.
I'll leave that to other commentators.
Ambassador Sinha, two very important points. One, this is US war against drugs. Does this indicate the US next will go after whether it's Colombia or Cuba and does not want China or Russia's influence in the Western Hemisphere? Does this bring the US directly in collision with China and Russia, and the fact that the Chinese have massive investments in Venezuela, the Russians in Cuba?
You know, as far as Chinese investments in Venezuela are concerned, they're probably less than Chinese investments in other countries in the region. But be that as it may, I think the China and Russia have a presence. They've always had a presence in Latin America, in Venezuela in particular. But was that a threat to the United States? I guess only the US can judge that. But to make another point, because we had elections in our neighborhood in Pakistan, and the most popular leader and the person who's supposed to have won that election is in jail.
Yes.
And we have a government which has been installed by the army, and the self-appointed field marshal is being feted in the White House. So I don't want to carve a sphere of influence for India, but what happens in our neighborhood certainly concerns us. Look what's happening in Bangladesh. There was
Yes.
a movement there which overthrew a legitimately elected government, and now we have jihadis running all over. Is that the sort of exceptionalism we are looking at? Because I think we need to be very careful, and that's why I said when you open the Pandora's box, the R2P, I was very much in the UN in New York, that I know we India opposed it precisely for these reasons, because it'd be used for your own ends and under a rubric of larger common good. So I think what has happened, I'm not in any way trying to defend President Maduro and his regime. On the contrary, I'm aware of sort of the shenanigans that went
The
on there.
atrocities.
What I have a
Yes.
problem is the way he was abducted and brought there. I mean, he's a fugitive from justice, according to what I've read from the U.S. government, the administration. But the fact is, there are many fugitives from justice. Do you go after all of them and pick them out from wherever they are in their holes? After all, Saddam Hussein was picked up
Yes.
from Iraq, and see what happens. What had happened to Iraq in Afghanistan? See what's happening in Afghanistan. So I think
Look at what
the
happened in
problem is,
Libya, and nobody's defending Colonel Gaddafi.
look
Nobody's
at Syria.
defending.
Look at Syria. We have a person who was on the most wanted list, in the sanctions list of the UN, is now sitting as president. Of course, he could have
Oh,
reformed
absolutely.
himself,
Ambassador
but
Neumann does not
never change
agree.
his spots.
She
I
wants to
don't
come in, but
know.
I want to bring in General Hasnain before I lose him again. Ambassador Neumann, give me a moment. Daniel Silverberg, give me a moment. General Hasnain, on the military aspect, as an aside, I want to raise the point. Has the myth of Chinese anti-stealth been shattered? Look at how Chinese air defense networks were blind to the US offensive. Sir, is this another setback to the Chinese-made weapons and systems after Operation Sindoor?
Thank you, Gaurav, for having me on your show. I'm sorry the audio was not too good in the beginning before I could join. So I've not really followed the entire show, but I've got your question exactly. Yes, there's no doubt that when you make an assessment of Chinese weapons and wherever they have performed, we've seen this now twice, the second time 2025-26, the performance obviously has been of a very low quality. I'm not sure in the case of Venezuela whether the Venezuelan armed forces were prepared to resist. Now, that is a question, that's a bit of a doubt in the mind, because if they were ready to resist, and if in that case they could not discern the early warning of an impending US raid, then obviously the quality of weaponry that they had, the quality of radars, early warning equipment, is highly suspect. But having said that, I would also add one more comment on the military aspects. The United States has they've done a fairly professional job, no doubt. I believe they've been preparing for the better part of 6 months on the intel regarding Venezuelan deployment and protection and security for their president. But the history of the United States Special Forces, apart from the absolutely outstanding action against Osama bin Laden, has not
Yes.
been very good either. And to think that they can take out something like this through a surgical strike going into Mexico or going into Colombia or going into Cuba, etc., you'll have to think many times over. I may remind everyone what happened to the Delta Force way back in 1979, 1980,
In Iran,
when an attempt
yes.
was made to try and rescue the 54 hostages who were taken there hostage in Tehran during the Iranian Revolution. So I think it would be a very risky thing to take
Okay.
this as an example and start executing operations all over the Western Hemisphere just to take out various offenders under the garb of national interest.
Okay, Daniel Silverman, how do you view America saying will not permit Russian and Chinese or foreign influence in the Western Hemisphere? What is the US appreciation? How is China likely to respond to this beyond their opposition to these actions? Or will China just take this template and try it in Taiwan 2027?
I frankly don't think that that China's leadership is impacted one way or another in terms of their calculation on Taiwan regarding what happens in Venezuela. When President Xi thinks that it's the right moment to attack Taiwan, then he'll do it regardless of what's happening in the Western Hemisphere, Ukraine, or any other part of the world. And it's the job of the United States and key allies like India and Japan to dissuade him from doing that. I don't think that this operation is going to have a significant impact on U.S. relations with any of our allies or adversaries at this point. I am concerned as a former
Okay.
longtime lead congressional counsel who was responsible for war powers and congressional oversight of military action. I frankly am concerned that there was such distrust between the administration and Congress that
And
not even the
Congress.
Gang of Eight, not even a small group of members was briefed on this. But in terms of what this means for U.S. foreign policy, it is still so early. We simply don't know. What we do know is there's going to be a major effort to stabilize Venezuela's oil economy to make sure that it's diversified and not merely in the hands of the ruling elite. But even for that to happen, so many steps, Gaurav, need to take place first.
Okay.
The U.S.
Okay,
needs to
Ambassador
unwind
Sinha.
sanctions regime.
Ambassador Sinha, before I bring in Ambassador Neumann, Ambassador Sinha, you've served in Venezuela. So the way Daniel was saying, do you actually see US firms now move and take advantage of the oil? Would that bring prices down? Would it also, if I may ask, reduce Indian dependence on Russian oil?
You know, Gaurav, before President Chavez came to power in 1999, you had American companies basically investing and exploiting the oil resources in the Orinoco Belt and in that entire
Yes.
area in Venezuela.
Chevron,
And
yes.
they built up the oil industry in Maracaibo. They built up the oil industry in Venezuela. So there is absolutely right that the American investment, American companies did help, but it created a kleptocracy in Venezuela. You had the oligarchs pocketing most of that wealth, and the people that is why the people didn't really benefit, and that is why President Chavez won the election and came to power. And he came to power as a charismatic leader. I can't say the same for President Maduro, but the fact is that there was a reaction. And since the Chavistas have mismanaged since then, and the situation is so dire that Venezuela, with the largest oil reserves in the
Yes.
world, is producing a pittance and exporting even less. So I think if the oil industry is stabilized by American and other companies, why only American, by other companies also, it would be a good thing. But that's going to take a long time because the condition of those
Will have to be. Ambassador
facilities,
Neumann, you wanted to come in
not
on
good.
Venezuelan oil. Do you see American companies now exploit that?
Well, let me correct the former ambassador, the gentleman, His Excellency, on a point of fact, right? Not opinion, fact. Venezuelan oil has never been in the hands of the oligarchs. This is some like Russian disinformation campaign that I've been living through for decades. It went simply from foreign ownership. Brits were the first ones, then the Americans, and then which is why you had so much of the upper class was related to the Rockefeller family, related by either marriage or business-wise. So you had the Brits, and then the Americans, and then it was nationalized and taken by the Venezuelan government. Not for 1 second ever in the history of Venezuela have Venezuelan citizens, so-called oligarchs, ever owned a Venezuelan oil.
No,
So
it's only the
don't give me
rich
this
few
oligarch
is what Ambassador
pocketed
says.
it, because it's
Okay,
simply
Ambassador,
false.
since
I
the
didn't
point has
say
been
that the
raised,
oligarchs ran the
kindly
oil
respond before I bring in
companies.
General
Not the
Obviously not.
Middle
Hasnain.
East. Venezuela is also not the
Ambassador
Middle East.
Sinha.
Yeah, I
Ambassador
think
Sinha.
what I said was misunderstood. I didn't say that the oligarchs owned the oil. They benefited from the oil revenues. People in Venezuela, the upper classes, the rich people, they benefited. I'm not saying that they ran the oil companies or they owned the oil companies. Certainly not. I mean, we know who owns ExxonMobil and Chevron and
Yes.
ConocoPhillips and Texaco, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that argument is fallacious. But anyway, I think we'll have to wait and see what happens, and because the situation is still unfolding.
And the last 30 seconds that I have on this part of the show, Daniel Silverman, your reading of Mette Frederiksen, the Prime Minister of Denmark, saying, do not threaten to take over Greenland. This is a very bizarre situation that one NATO country is asking another NATO country, do not take over. But do you think President Trump will?
I think President Trump and his team feel remarkably emboldened right now. I think that they believe our adversaries are quaking in fear of the United States. Personally, I don't think that's the case, but I sense that that is their perception, and that our allies, like Denmark, are going to be more willing to bend to our will. I think that that could be a strategic miscalculation, and I think the Denmark's prime minister's remarks were spot on point of saying, let's take a calm, rational approach here, and figure out a solution. If the
Oh,
United
absolutely,
States,
because
instead
what
of
would
with a
that mean?
stick,
So absolutely, what would that mean for NATO if one NATO country is threatening to take over territory of another NATO country, Ambassador Sinha? And also your reading of President Trump's statement on India and Prime Minister Narendra Modi, words to the effect that they wanted to make me happy. The Prime Minister of India, words to that effect, he's a good man, he's a good guy, he knows I'm not very happy and it's important to make me happy.
You know, the problem, I'm not
Ambassador
going to
Sinha.
comment on what President Trump said in terms of making him happy. But what I can say is the Prime Minister of India is a good man, then I think you're showing your love in completely the wrong way. Because by sanctioning India 50% tariffs and then threatening to increase the tariffs, I don't think you're going to be very popular here.
Oh, absolutely. I want to thank all my guests for being a part of this show.